So as you know at this stage, the theme I've chosen for the month of May is the notion of practices that lead to mystical states. And for me, one of the most important ones is spending time in nature. I live in the middle of the forest with a creek running through called Pina Creek, and I spend a lot of time down there just watching what nature does and then writing short stories or poems. So this was a poem I wrote actually on July 9th, 2002. I called it The Dance Master, An Encounter with Light, as I was watching the sunlight, dance on the tree leaves and in the waters of the creek. I've waited 8 minutes for you, and it was worth every second. What an exhibition you've just put on. I once saw a movie where the combatants ran up vertical walls and jumped incredible distances from rooftop to rooftop. I thought it was so hokey. But here you are now, outperforming them. I watch you balance on a single fragile willow leaf and then leap onto another without once losing your footing. I see you dancing on the water without once losing your faith, unlike Peter. I intentionally disturb the water, creating ripples and waves. You take it all in your stride, not missing a step, in perfect harmony with the music. I've waited 8 minutes for you. What a journey you took, 93 million miles of star space. And at the end of it all, you landed, not with a crash, not even with a thump, but lithely and lightly. Was Jesus punning when he said, "My burden is light"? Perhaps he didn't mean the weight of the burden, but rather its composition. What if the burden of mission is to recognize and become light? I've waited 8 minutes for you. I've waited 5 billion years for you. I waited because I bought the illusion of time. Now, I don't have to wait anymore. Teach me to walk on the waves. Teach me to dance on a leaf. Enlighten me. These are words inspired by God. So for the month of May, as I said, I've been looking at practices that lead to mystical states. And on May 4th, I looked at the practice of mathematics and the practice of mythology as leading to mystical states. And then last Sunday, May the 11th, I looked at Mariology, devotion to Mother Mary, and meditation, as mystical possibilities. So today I'm going to do a recap of these four and then open it up to a Q&A. So let me revise what I had to say about what I would call the mysticism of mathematics. So I love playing around with numbers. And one of the most fascinating numbers for me is the entire concept of zero. Zero, the notion of zero and the symbol for zero in mathematics was invented by Babylon about 300 before the Common Era, so 2,300 years ago. And then 600 years later, independently, the Mayans of Mesoamerica invented the concept of zero, about 300 the Common Era. In about 600 the Common Era, India invented it, and then Islam took it up in about 800 AD, and it came into Europe 1000 AD. So the Europeans were really the last to come up with the notion of zero. So it's a fascinating concept. When you say, for instance, how can you have nothing? If you say, I have nothing, I can say, I don't have anything, but how can I have nothing? Where would I carry it? And then the next notion for me is the whole idea of negative numbers. How could you possibly have -3 apples? If nothing comes from nothing, is -15 apples the same thing as -3 apples? So the whole notion of negative numbers is fascinating to me. It really stretches the mind. In mathematics, in mystical mathematics, 0 and infinity are pretty much the same thing. If you multiply anything by 0, you get 0. If you divide anything by 0, you get infinity. If you multiply anything by infinity, you get infinity. And if you divide anything by infinity, you get 0. So what happens when these two ends of the spectrum come together? What happens when you divide 0 by 0? Or you divide infinity by infinity? So for me, just playing around with these, it's like, for me, they're like Zen koans. you have to back out of it into the experience of the mystery because you can't solve it kind of rationally. So all you can hope to do is, through mathematics perhaps, get into an altered state of consciousness where you can experience the transcendent mystery. But then it has extraordinary practical benefits, as part of our reality-making mechanism. So we start off then with data which are delivered by the sensorium. We drink in data through our eyes and our ears and our nose and touch, so whatsoever. So the first stage is just the data, drinking in data. And then the brain, the second stage is the brain begins to process data and turn data into information. Because there's a very important distinction between data and information. Data is useful, but only when it becomes information. So if you take, for instance, in the alphabet, in the English alphabet, we have 26 letters. But those individual letters don't give us any information until you begin to combine them. So if I take 4 letters from the alphabet, E, I, L, and V, it's just data. It's meaningless unless I arrange them. I can create the word vile from it, or the word evil from it, or the word live from it. So there's totally different information hidden in the data, depending on how you process it. And then this processing of the data leads to our experience, what we think actually happened, or what we think we actually witnessed in the world out there. And then we put all of these experiences together, and they create our memory bank, our storage for future use. And then from this memory bank, we create our models of reality. So reality is it's like the amalgam of all your memories. It becomes your model of life. It becomes a kind of a personal cosmology. And then there's an important difference between your personal reality and the consensual reality of the group. So it's the intersection, said in mathematics, of all the individual personal realities that combine, and the intersection becomes the consensual reality, what the culture believes to be true. And it becomes very difficult then to experience what the culture tells you does not exist. And this is the problem with consensual reality. It becomes very, very difficult to become a mystic in such a situation. So the mystics are the ones who break out of this, and mathematicians do that beautifully. And so when you look at how we seem to organize data, there's order as the first level, and then there's chaos, and then finally there's randomness. So chaos has some level of organization, but randomness apparently has none. But I don't believe that. I think, in fact, that these order, chaos, and randomness are simply 3 states which demand deeper and deeper levels of intelligent exploration in order to reveal their underlying mystical simplicity. And for me, that's the mission of mathematics, to dig out that underlying unity consciousness. So mathematics and science in particular, then, it allows us to kind of to recognize patterns in nature. So either mathematics is either recognizing patterns, pre-existing patterns, or it's discovering hidden ones, or it's even inventing patterns, which are very important. So I love the notion, for instance, of what's called imaginary numbers. Imaginary numbers were first discovered by a guy called Girolamo Cardano in 1500. He was one of the first to encounter the square roots of negative numbers when he was solving cubic equations. And then in 1520, a guy called Raphael Bombelli defined and began to use them. In the 1600s, René Descartes named them derogatively. He gave the name imaginary numbers. He thought they were ridiculous. But then great mathematicians like Euler in 1700 and Gauss in 1780, they legitimized these numbers. And the concept then of imaginary numbers led to complex numbers, which is a combination of ordinary real numbers and imaginary numbers. And they're hugely important in space travel. So these totally made up numbers are vital to space travel. So I think that the notion of randomness will continue to shrink at an accelerating pace until we see the divine plan in all its radical, mystical simplicity. And for me, that's what mathematics does. I think of an example, for instance, like the Fibonacci series. Fibonacci in the year 1202, looking at the golden ratio, discovered that by adding 2 numbers, each number to the one that went before it, you created a sequence. So you have 1, 1, add 1 and 1, you get 2, add 1 and 2, you get 3, add 2 and 3, you get 5, add 3 and 5, you get 8, then 13, 21, 34, 55, 89, 144, etc. But the interesting thing is, this wasn't just kind of happenstance. You find the Fibonacci series in art, you find it in music, and you find it in planetary and galactic motion. And you find it all over nature. You find it in the seed distribution of flowers. You find it in broccoli. You find it in rabbit breeding. You find it in trees. You find it in blood vessels. And you even find it in hurricanes. And so this notion of the Fibonacci series is this deep, deep dive into the mysticism of mathematics. By the way, Fibonacci was also the guy who imported Hindu and Arabic numerals into the kind of the Western mindset. Before that, you had a kind of Roman numerals. So imagine the difficulty if you're trying to estimate, for instance, the number of minutes in a week. So there's 7 days in a week, and there's 24 hours in every day, and there's 60 minutes in every hour. So multiplying 7 by 24 by 60 is fairly simple in the Hindu and Arabic numerals. Now try multiplying it in Roman numerals. Try multiplying VII by XXIV by LV and see how long it takes you to get an answer. And so Fibonacci brought this extraordinary beauty back into Europe from the Hindu and the Arabic notions. I told you I was part of a group for many years called DMILS, Distant Mental Influences on Living Systems. So I was doing research on the effects of intercessory prayer at a distance, on human attributes, particularly kind of self-esteem, anxiety, and depression levels. Another member of the group was a guy called Roger Nelson, and he worked at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research, called PAIR, and he had developed these random number generators, and he'd stashed them all over the world. And he was watching what happens when you spit out just Boolean algebra, just zeros and one on a regular basis. You would imagine that over the course of a million kind of numbers, you get roughly 500,000 zeros and 500,000 ones. And what he found out was that, when there were some really important global events happening, the randomization process was thrown out and there was a certain level of order created. And on 2 occasions, on 9/11 and the death of Princess Diana on August the 31st, 1997, the randomization process was thrown out and order was introduced. But the interesting thing was, it didn't happen on 9/11. It happened on the day before 9/11. And it didn't happen on the day Princess Diana died. It happened on the day before she died. And so somehow, out of the randomness was this kind of a precognitive ability at a global level. I call it mind at large. So these are the kinds of mysteries that mathematics introduces to us. Another member of the group was a guy called Helmut Schmidt. He was at Texas A&M. And he was using random number generators. He was generating data, zeros and ones, millions of them, but he didn't display them. But he would bring people in to see if through intentionality, they could throw out the randomization process. And he found out that they could. As long as the numbers weren't displayed, the intention could change the randomization process and introduce order into it. But if any living thing witnessed the data, it could not subsequently be altered. And he even tried it with a bowl of goldfish. He displayed the data in front of a bunch of goldfish, and the fact that they had witnessed it meant it could not subsequently be changed. Now, that's the observer effect in spades. So I would call it kind of the pre-observer influence effect. So this is a kind of a pre-processing position of order on the data. Another member of the group was Dean Radin. And Dean Radin was the scientist in residence at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma. And he set up experiments where he had subjects in a room which was shielded rooms, with the EEGs on their brains and rigged up to galvanic skin responders. And they had a monitor in front of them, and in a different part of the compound, he would flash images on the screen of the subject being tested. And nanoseconds before the image came on, the brain would react. So there were different kinds of images, like horrific car crashes, or children laughing, or whatever. And so instance before the image was displayed on the screen, the galvanic skin response and the EEG recorded that there was a mind beyond the mind that colors the information and reacts before the sensorium is presented with the data. So it's a kind of a pre-sensory data processing. So what I've deduced from all these is that precognition is when mind is mastering time. And clairvoyance is when mind is mastering space. And psychokinesis is where mind is mastering matter. And telepathy is where mind is mastering mind. So they all involve mind mastering energy. For me then, there's a spirituality of mathematics and a spirituality of science. Many of the great scientists of history were polymaths, and they were deeply religious people. They were filled with awe for mysteries of all kind, and they approached the task of real science, and the task of real science is its core spirituality is a never-ending attempt to explain the immanence of God, in other words, the natural cosmos, while bathing in the ineffable transcendence of the divine. So to hold these two pieces, that's the spirituality of science and mathematics. Properly undertaken, then, there's a deep spirituality of science and its rigorous methodology. It's a template that can be of huge value to spiritual seekers. And so true scientists then, as I've studied them and looked at them, have a combination of virtues. The first thing is a commitment to the search, like seek and you shall find. That is the commitment and the search of great scientists and mathematicians. Secondly, there's the humility in admitting errors. We were wrong in some instances. And realizing that sometimes it is by asking the wrong questions and conducting the wrong experiments that they learn what the right questions are and what the right experiments could be. They're also willing to share their data and to challenge their colleagues. And finally, they're willing to trust their imagination. Imagination is the single most important gift of a mathematician or a scientist. Much more important than ability to reason. So that's what I had to say about mathematics, the mysticism of mathematics. I went on then 2 Sundays ago to talk about the mysticism of mythology. So communicating with God. And I believe that there are 3 ways of listening to a sacred scripture, or to a mystical teaching. The first way is literal, where I'm trying to grok the teaching with my left brain, my rationality. Then the second way of listening is symbolic. It is right brain and is creative. And then the third way is mystical, where I'm meeting it not at the brain level, but at the level of the soul and of the heart. And that's why I differentiate between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge is simply data that are generated by the sensorium and processed by the brain, whereas wisdom is data that are generated by the soul and processed by the heart. So then there are 3 ways of listening, I believe. There are 3 ways also of translating from any one language into another language. And the first one is literal, where you translate a verb with a verb, a noun with a noun, an adjective with an adjective. But you lose a whole bunch of stuff. You can't get humor in that kind of literal translation, and you can't get puns in that kind of translation. The second way to translate is called dynamic transference, where you try to establish what the intention of the author, the original author was, and what the intended audience was, and what society was like back then when it was being written. How did society organize itself? And then to do the translation with all those kind of perspectives in mind. And the third way to translate is called paraphrasing, where you make the translation say what you want it to say. And unfortunately, many of the fundamentalist Christian Bibles are written as paraphrases rather than dynamic transference. And then I believe that in speaking about God, or to God, there are 3 distinct languages. The first one is called cataphatic language. It is the language of theologians, where theologians are caught in the left brain and they're trying to understand God with left brain thinking and left brain terminology, which is a ludicrous exercise. The second way of language is apophatic language. It is the language of Hinduism and Zen koans. So Hinduism will say X, no, God is not X. How about Y? No, God is not Y. Z? No, God is not Z. They keep saying neti, neti, neti. No, no, no. And Zen koans are about getting us out of our intellectual, rational mind so that we can experience the ineffable, even if we can't articulate it. And so the great mystics will say stuff like, Meister Eckhart said, I pray daily to God to rid me of God. And he talked about the Godhead, which is beyond God. And Buddhism will say, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. In other words, don't get stuck in theology. Go beyond, your understanding of Buddha and counter instead your Buddha nature. And in Hinduism, we have the notion of Parabrahma. We think that Brahma is the ultimate. We talk about Jiva, Atman, and Brahma. But in Hinduism, there's a Parabrahma, beyond Brahma itself. And Lao Tzu, way back, about 500 years before Christ, said, all things are born of being, and being is born of non-being. So even the category of being is meaningless when we're talking about God. because the Godhead is pure no-thingness. And no-thingness is not the absence of anything, but rather the potential for everything. It is I would describe it as the pre-random potentiality out of which order, meaning, and mysticism arise. And then the third level of language is parabolic language. So many years ago, I invented a term, I call it mythish. And mythish for me is mystical teaching in story form. Because the ways in which cultures archive their wisdom is always in mythology. And then mythish is, learning that particular language. So mythish for me is a sacred, secret language in which the true wisdom of a culture is archived and transmitted. So that's what I had to say about mythology 2 weeks ago. Last week I talked about the mysticism of Mariology and looked at the place of Mary in the life of Jesus. And so the first thing is she has an encounter with the angel Gabriel, who invites her to become the mother of God. Now I believe that every single soul is visited by the archangel Gabriel, that God whispers to all of us, remember that you are a God carrier. Every single one of us is divine, and our human bodies are meant to transport our divinity. Then Mary visits her cousin Elizabeth, who's pregnant with the John the Baptist to be, and Elizabeth says to Mary, when the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. So it's almost as if John the Baptist in utero was wrecking Jesus in utero. They recognized the divinity of each. But it was also that the two women were recognizing the divinity of the other woman. Not just that they were carrying the divine, but that they were divine beings themselves. And then you had the birth of Jesus. So we're being invited then, every single one of us, to give birth to our core self and to reveal who we really are. That every single one of us, as Meister Eckhart said, is meant to be a mother of God. And then at age 8 days, the little infant is presented in the temple. Because we have to recognize that every single newborn child is the latest prophet among us. It is God's most recent revelation. And so we honor the impulse to expose our children to the spiritual life by initiation into some wisdom tradition. And the great curse of our times for me is that so many children are being raised by screens, and instead of being initiated into some wisdom tradition, they're being initiated into the wisdom of technology, a kind of AI, a kind of Ahrimanic influence. And then there's the finding of the child Jesus at age 12 in the temple, debating with the wise ones and the scripture scholars. Because before age 7, we only think egocentrically. Every single one of us is a little narcissist. And we are thinking about me. I'm egocentric. At age 7, we begin to think ethnocentrically about the tribe and its values, the group and its values. And then about age 12, we begin to think ecocentrically. We're self-reflecting about our own values and beliefs and those of our tribe and our culture. And so as we mature, I keep saying we need to commit 4 murders in order to move into cosmic thinking. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about, physically taking a life. But the first murder is I have to kill my ego. Not in the sense that I don't need an ego, I do, but I have to disidentify with this little version of myself. Then secondly, I have to kill my father, which means I have to transcend my tribal affiliation. Not dishonor it, but transcend and include it. Thirdly, I've got to kill my guru, because no teacher can take you all the way. You have to honor the guru, but go beyond, because you're going to be in circumstances that the guru never experienced. And then fourthly, you have to kill your God, because no theology can take you all the way to source. And so we have to learn to outgrow our religious affiliations and discover our own truths, creating our own tried and tested cosmology without dishonoring what came before. Then you have this glorious assumption of Mary into heaven, where we recognize the feminine face of God for the first time ever is a blessed quaternity, not a blessed trinity. So we have the female and the male aspects represented. So the blueprint is now in place, courtesy of the Holy Spirit, to finally wake up to the realization of God manifest in both male and female aspects. And then you have Mary being crowned Queen of Heaven. This is the culmination of Mary's assumption, a celebration of the motherhood, the archetype of mother as a divine being. And then finally you have the miracle, the wedding feast at Cana, where Mary pushes Jesus into his public ministry. She who had given him birth, from her own body, is now pushing him into his public ministry by saying, they have no wine, see to it. Now, in the early church then, Mary occupies this extraordinarily important position. After the ascension of Christ back into heaven, the apostles are gathered in Jerusalem, and we are told in Acts of the Apostles chapter 1, they're all joined together constantly in prayer, along with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. So she's holding the little group together, the Jesus movement together, until Pentecost arrives. And then she withdraws to live in Ephesus with the Apostle John. And this is a very strong early Christian tradition, that Mary lived near Ephesus, modern-day Turkey, with the Apostle John, because Christ had asked John to look after his mother and for Mary to look after John. And the house of the Virgin Mary is located in a place called Mount Kerosos near Ephesus. And it was rediscovered based on the mystical visions of a German nun called Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich. And it was visited, in fact, by several popes, including Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI. And then there was a very famous council at Ephesus in the year 431, where there's a big debate going on in the early church between the Patriarch of Constantinople, a guy called Nestorius, and the Patriarch of Alexandria, a guy called Cyril. And Nestorius was claiming that Mary was Christotokos, a Christ carrier, but not Theotokos, not a God carrier. And Cyril was in favor of the title Theotokos, means God carrier. And so the whole council was called. And finally, Nestorius was declared a heretic. And the belief was that Mary was Theotokos. She was a God carrier, not just a Christ carrier. You have Mary in the medieval church then, when God had become a distant, demanding deity, and even Jesus had become a judge. Now Christians are appealing to the motherhood. And so there'll be a big emphasis on the rosary, and on cathedrals dedicated to Mary, and on hymnals to Mary. And it was this rosary that kept the faith alive in Ireland during penal days between 1600 and 1829, when Catholicism was a crime in Ireland, and priests were killed on sight, so the Mass could not be celebrated. It was the rosary that kept the faith of the Irish alive. The great cathedrals of Europe are being built to Mary in the 12th century. You have 5 great cathedrals in France being dedicated to her, 4 in Italy, 3 in Spain, 3 in England. Westminster Abbey was dedicated to Mary, 2 in Germany, 1 in Poland, and 1 in Austria. So you have all these beautiful cathedrals dedicated to Mary in the hope that at least a mother could have compassion and love for us. And you have all these great hymnals as well. And for our times then, Mary is honoured by the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, which is promulgated by Pius IX in December of 1854. And then you had a whole bunch of Marian apparitions, Lourdes, France in 1858, Knock in Ireland in 1879, Fatima in Portugal in 1917. Then you have the doctrine of the Assumption of Mary into heaven, which was promulgated in 1950 by Pius XII. And you have the coronation of Mary, Queen of Heaven. So you have this, in our own times, this extraordinary dedication to Mary. And finally, last Sunday, I looked at the mysticism of meditation. There's an old Zen proverb that says, enlightenment is an accident. You can't program it. But if you meditate regularly, you become accident prone. And so my own definition is that I distinguish between prayer and meditation. For me, prayer is the immanence of God seeking alignment with the transcendence of God. And meditation is the transcendence of God seeking expression through the immanence of God. So they're all an internal dialogue between mystery and manifestation. And so this intersection of mystery and manifestation, the intersection of transcendence and immanence, it happens in lots of ways. It happens in sacred spaces, what in Gaelic we call ÓLaoire, thin places, where the membrane separating the mystical from the mundane is diaphanous. It happens in special historical events, like the birth of Jesus. It happens in charismatic personalities. It happens in dreams, and it happens in meditation. There are basically 2 kinds of meditation. Concentration meditation, where you focus on a mantra, or you focus on a candle flame, or mindfulness meditation, where you're focused, you let anything address you, but you don't get attached to anything. So both of them are attempting to strive for mastery over attention. Both are trying to bring the unconscious to full consciousness. So the essence of meditation is to continually disidentify with lesser versions of the self and re-identify with a greater sense of self. What Hinduism will call Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that. the very thing you're contemplating, the divine, is who you actually are. And then you give birth to God through compassion. So in conclusion then, I would say that it is time to bring on the mysticists. Mysticist was a word I invented many years ago, which is a combination of mystic and scientist, which I believe the future will hold. Beings who are both au fait with the current science, and at the same time are deeply mystical people like Teilhard de Chardin. So mysticists live where real science meets true spirituality. And their purpose is to identify the love impulse in the soul of humanity, the glowing embers which the avatars of all traditions have secretly tended, and blow on them so that they burst into purifying flames of unconditional love for all sentient beings. Because there is no place where God cannot be born. And there is no time when God cannot incarnate. So you must midwife your life and thus usher divinity into your day. Our task then is to turn the prison of the present into the womb of the future. The vocation of Homo Spiritualis is to allow ourselves to be impregnated by the transcendence of God so that we can give birth to the immanence of God. The objective of life is to set God free from our projections so God can set us free from our illusions. Namaste, my brothers and sisters. So let's open it up to a Q&A.
You mentioned the knowledge of the head, left brain, right brain, and the wisdom of the heart. And it's both received and transmitted there. And I'm wondering, because so much of the information that we receive in our world today doesn't appear to be coming from the heart, to what extent the energy and intent of all that information that's flying at us affects where and how we receive it?
Okay, it's a great question, Tom. And there is this distinction between knowledge and wisdom, absolutely. The problem is that, the levers of power are always kind of hijacked by a kind of narcissistic individuals. Approximately somewhere between 5 and 10% of the world population is born as narcissists. And there's a difference between narcissism, between psychopathy and sociopathy, between a psychopath and a sociopath. Psychopaths are born somewhere between 5 and 10%. Sociopaths are made by society, by the trainings they're given. And so it's been my experience that, that although psychopaths only represent somewhere between 5 and 10% of the population, they represent a majority of people in particular kinds of positions of power. You find them in politics, overrepresented in politics. You find them overrepresented in financial institutions. You find them overrepresented in the medical community. You find them overrepresented in educational society. You find them overrepresented in the hierarchies of the churches. So somehow these narcissistic, psychopathic individuals always manage to gravitate to the top of the pile. And then they control the levers of power, and they create sociopaths underneath them who will do their will. And so these sociopaths then, these second level or third level down, they're the people who are doing the propagandizing. And so there's two wings to it. The first one is to censor the truth, and the second one is to promote propaganda. And so we're being deluged constantly with disinformation and misinformation. And very, very often the people who tell us that, they're trying to combat misinformation are the people who are actually promoting it. And so I've never owned a television set in my life. And I've never ordered a newspaper in my life because I believe that they're basically propaganda weapons. So if you expose yourself constantly to television and newspapers, you're getting what the psychopaths above are telling the sociopaths beneath to promote and to promulgate. Now I think actually there's a level above that. I believe that there are actually non-human entities that are orchestrating this. I told you one time, I seed my dreams on a regular basis. And a few years ago, when I was going to sleep at night, I wanted to distinguish between sin and evil. And I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and the message I got was that sin is the individual infraction of a human precept. It's just breaking a human law. Whereas evil is a cosmic conspiracy using human intermediaries to separate souls from source. So there is an agenda. There are dark forces as well as light beings as well, whose mission on planet Earth is to separate us from source. And so they're the ones who are controlling the psychopaths, who are controlling the sociopaths, who are controlling the news outlets that we get. So it becomes really important. Get rid of your television set or your radio or your newspapers and begin to think for yourself. Create like-minded pods of people who are interested in listening to wisdom rather than to listening to information. Because no matter how much you try to defend yourself against propaganda, if you're exposed long enough, suddenly it becomes the truth, by virtue of there being no other possibility. So kill your television, get rid of your newspapers, meditate more, get into nature more, spend time with little children more, kind of pray the rosary more, do Eucharistic encounters, and then you'll flood with wisdom rather than mere factual data.
So my question is, so I think I lost my counterpart back in April, and so I've moved, and I'm having, I'm just going to say it, I'm having such an amazing time connecting with him in the multidimensional 5D. But I don't want to go back into reality because it's so nice where I am, and I feel like I have really fluid conversations, and
Brilliant.
yeah, it's pretty amazing. And then I don't know how to go back into balance both worlds. Yeah. I don't know how to do that, and I know maybe that's something that I can ask you. How do you balance the connections after someone's passed and you're here, and how does that work?
The first thing here, my heart goes out to you, Pat.
Thank you.
Understanding what it's like to lose a soulmate. I can totally understand it. The only word I would change a little bit, when you said, how do I get back into reality? You're in reality. What you thought was real isn't real. The world around us, is the lowest level of reality. So it's not that there's the real and the unreal. There's the fact that there are gradations of reality, that the deepest, densest, darkest level of reality is the 3D, where we're stuck in these physical spacesuits and believe that this is the entire reality. It's real, but it's the lowest and least important level of reality. As we move ourselves up through the Hindu model, we go to the etheric body, the elan vital, the life force, that generated a physical body, a physical container. It's like if you're going to do deep sea diving, you're going to have to put a mask on, an oxygen tent, and flippers, and jump off the ship. And so the equipment you have underwater is not who you really are. It's just what you need to be a deep sea diver. And so in three-dimensional reality, the physical body you occupy, I call it my spacesuit. This is not my ultimate self. This is just the equipment I need in order to experience life at a three-dimensional level. So it's real, but it's not the ultimate reality. So as you're moving, when you go from your etheric body, with your elan vital, and you go to your astral body, which is the place where dreams come, you've transcended time and you've transcended space completely. And if you learn how to dream lucidly, you're transcending even mere matter. Because if you're dreaming and you want to test whether or not I'm actually dreaming, is this a lucid dream? There's a very simple test. You put your hand against a solid object and you push. If your hand doesn't go through it, you're just dreaming. If your hand goes through it, you're in a lucid dream, a very different space. So my sense is in listening to you that these encounters with your beloved is a much, much more important level of reality than the one that you're trying to come back down into, and that you believe somehow that this is the reality. This is not the reality, Pat. This is a very, very low grade reality. And the encounters you're having with your beloved at this third level are much more real and much more important. So the question is then, how can you take what you're learning from those encounters, and how do you now feed the physical body and change the physical reality by bringing those kind of data and that kind of wisdom back down here, not abandoning it as it's just a figment of your imagination. This is very much more important reality than the spacesuit you occupy. But then you have to learn to live in a spacesuit, and you have to try to draw information and kind of wisdom back down from those encounters. Ask him the kinds of questions. Ask him how you're meant to navigate the day-to-day activities of life without his physical presence. Because I guarantee to you, he's much more present to you than he was even when he was in his spacesuit.
Can you talk a little bit about this transition everybody's talking about from 3D to 4D to 5D, and kind of quite what that means? Because people have said you're going to have two different worlds, and the muggles go one way and the other people go one way. And kind of what is the reality of that experience? Will we still have spacesuits to play with? And
Great question. Great question.
Thank you, sir.
So the truth is that we're in muggledom already, because there are people in different spaces, even as we reside in three-dimensional reality. You listen to people's conversations and you realize there's already this extraordinary fragmentation, among us right now. So the question is, what happens when we ascend through the different dimensions? Now, I believe that the Hinduism teaches us that there's 7 different levels of body. So we start off with the physical container, the three-dimensional body, which is subject to gravity, and which operates through the sensorium. And then the next level is the etheric body, the élan vital, the energy of the system, of which the physical body is simply a printout. And then there's the third level, which is the astral body, and it's the place where our emotions reside and where we dream at night. And it's also the repository of all of the life experiences of an incarnation. When it just ends, we archive all that information at the astral body. The fourth level is the mental body, and it is the place of the archetypes, the Platonic ideals. And then the fifth level is the psychic body, where we're reconnected with our psychic abilities, clairaudience, clairsentience, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, precognition, all these things. And then the sixth level is the soul self, and ultimately there's the God self. Now, they're all true of the individual person. And we move through those levels depending on our awareness, our level of awareness. We can operate in spacesuits, but not believe that spacesuits is our ultimate destiny. We can operate at much, much higher levels. And the practices I've mentioned, like Mariology or meditation or mathematics or spending time with children or nature, these elevate us already out of identification with just our physical selves. But now I have a belief system that the same thing is true of the planet itself, that the very planet itself has 7 different levels of body. And the first level, I call it the physiosphere. It is the third rock from the sun. It's just a rock. And at some stage, a great soul volunteered to animate this rock and said to God, send me to the third rock from the sun in that solar system, and I will breathe life until I throw up a life form capable of recognizing its own divinity, and ipso facto, the divinity of all other life forms with which it shares the planet. So it got this physiosphere of this rock, which can be studied by like physics. And then it created a womb, and the womb we call the atmosphere. So it surrounded itself with a womb, the moisture shield necessary in order to breathe life. That was stage 2. Stage 3 then is the biosphere. Now that it has created a womb, it is bringing forth flora and fauna of various kinds. That's the biosphere. The fourth level is the noosphere, to borrow a word from Tyler de Chardin. And this is the sheath of consciousness that surrounds the biosphere. Now, we're in between the biosphere and the noosphere at this stage. And it's a very dangerous transition. Because in the movement from biosphere to noosphere, we're creating all kinds of artificial technologies and internet experiences, some which are really good and some which are terrible. So we have the capability, literally, of destroying the very planet as we move from biosphere to noosphere. But there are 3 places beyond that. The next one, I call it the animosphere. Anima is the Latin word for the soul. There's a soul of the planet itself that we need to move into. And then the next level, I call it the pneumosphere. Pneuma being the Greek word for the spirit, which is next to God. And then there's God itself. So the very planet itself is moving. Now, instinctively, we try to gravitate towards people who kind of have the same kind of frequency as ourselves, the same kinds of energies. Misery loves company. The birds of a feather flock together. We want to be around people, who have the same kind of energy as us. Is it an energy of anger or an energy of peace, whatever it is? And so the whole idea of heaven is not that we're separating the good from the bad, but that rather that people who have shed off their spacesuits, they want to gravitate to those frequencies that feel good to them, where they feel at home. So heaven is a gradation of frequencies, and every soul is going to be attracted to the kinds of souls with whom it kind of resonates, because it's love and compassion or whatever, or it's fear, it's anxiety, whatsoever. And so what is going to happen is there's going to be this kind of bifurcation point where there's all the kind of the muggles, to use your word, are stuck on the physiosphere, and the rest of us are in heaven. I think there will be kind of a fracturing of frequencies where we're going to be drawn to that level of the planet, and that those kinds of people that resonate at the same frequencies. So your frequency, I'm saying this to Tom Peters particularly. Tom is working with the dying right now. That's one of the things I keep saying to people at this stage. What I've seen is that people tend to die the way they live, and people tend to transition the way they die. And people tend to experience the other side initially in the way in which they transition. And then finally, they can move and they can heal. But initially, we're only capable of experiencing that level of reality that we've grown accustomed to while we're still in these spacesuits. So that's what the work is. The work is disidentifying merely with the three-dimensional spacesuit I occupy and learning to identify again and again and again with higher levels of myself, so that the transition into heaven is not a huge shift of frequency. It's just the natural consequence of what I've been working at, and that the planet itself is going to accommodate that. That there will be levels and dimensions where the various frequencies will feel comfortable. The guys who are into fear and anger and warfare, they'll continue to do it. And the guys who are into compassion and forgiveness and whatever, they're going to find a place where they're surrounded by like-minded individuals. So I don't believe in a kind of a split where God says, you're going to hell and you're coming to heaven. It's a gradation of frequencies for which we can prepare ourselves now as individual people and as communities.
I have a question, but I have a little verbal process beforehand to get to the question.
Sure.
So being is born of non-being, and that includes matter being born from antimatter, meaning matter born from antimatter, right? Particle versus antiparticle, which is that unmanifested energy layers, the blueprint of the house.
Yeah.
And that's the basis for 0-point energy, right? Negative energy, the ether, everything Tesla talked about and was trying to return to the planet. And when people go into this process of understanding, returning to the golden ratio, leaving behind the parasitic Fibonacci sequence, returning back into organic mathematics, basically, I think that there's going to be a lot of people who have a crack in their mental and emotional bodies, where they're going to have a fracture in such a way where they're still going to be in their spacesuit. We're still going to have to deal with them. And so my question is, what is the best way to prepare to support those people that are going to have a reality shift that's not going to be pleasant? Like, God doesn't care if everything's happy and pleasant, right? God doesn't, not every lesson is pleasurable and easy. And I feel like there's going to be a need for people to explain or support those people as they transition in their mental understanding of reality. And yes, there'll be people that will drop the body, but there's going to be a lot of people kind of in this frequency split that are going to get pulled along with the collective consciousness. And so what do you think is a good mode or self-preparation for supporting people that are going to have a really hard time?
So it's a great question and great comments on the science of it as well, Kelsey. Thanks for doing that, Pat. The first thing is the realization, the very important realization, that time is a human artifact. That when we incarnate, we have to trade global cosmic awareness for this tiny little laptop that we carry between our ears. And the realization that, if you believe in reincarnation, you get as many turns here on planet Earth as you need until you come to the realization yourself. And so we can't force a solution or a timeline on the solution to any problem. We have to do what we can at the moment and then presume that, it'll happen in God. This is God's gig, ultimately. This is not my gig, so I can only do what I'm capable of doing and then hand it over to God and say it'll happen in God's time. And therefore, not to try to artificially foist a timeline on the transition or to kind of, in some senses, force people into a new viewpoint. People are going to move at their own pace. So in the meantime, what do? Try to make sure that our own hearts are filled with compassion and love, not with judgment or not with anger against. Even if we have the right to kind of defend ourselves in some ways against kind of disinformation, that we have to do it in a loving way. So that how we prepare ourselves for the break is important as how we prepare the others for the break. We have to realize that, I don't have 100% guarantee that my viewpoint is correct. I can only say this is, to the best of my knowledge, this is what makes sense to me. But then by their fruits you shall know them. How does this person behave? How do they speak? How are they thinking? And if it's about fear and anxiety and depression and anger and warfare, obviously I'm feeding myself on the wrong kind of food. So very important to watch the output and the actions of people, including our own, and to hope then that that my lifestyle, how I'm living, is an articulation of what my belief systems are, and realize that we'll get as many times as chances as we need to come back until everyone learns through experience that the only thing that's real is love, and that the only thing that works is compassion. And if that takes another 100 lifetimes, so be it. Time is an artifact anyway. So to be an example of what the alternative looks like, without judgment of the other, having forgiveness for self and another, and then waiting God to determine what the timeline is going to be.
My focus is on your three types of listening,
Okay.
and like to focus on the mystical from heart and soul.
Right.
And I understand that you advocate embellishing that from being in nature, meditating, and
Yes.
with prayer.
Yes.
My question, one level deeper than that, how best to listen or hear what those three environments are providing to us? Where can you best connect with the seed corn or the north compass out of those three to connect with one's heart and soul for really listening to one's inner self?
Okay. So there's an image I came up with years and years and years ago, John. I imagined myself sitting at the back wall of a long, long, narrow room. And there's a small window up in the front wall. So I'm looking the length of the room at a small window at the other side of the wall. And I'm sitting meditating back here. And there's a circus passing by outside. And I can only see it as it engages the frame of the window. So now I can see a giraffe passing by, and he's gone. I know there's a cage full of monkeys passing by, and they pass on. I know there's an elephant passing, and he goes. And then there's a bunch of clowns, juggling or whatever, and they pass on. I have to resist the temptation of running up the room, sticking my head out to the window, and finding out, where did the elephant go to? I have to stay at the back wall and just, as long as it engages the frame, focus on it, let it go, and then focus on the next piece and let it go. So it's the meditation technique of being totally present to the moment, not getting invested in anything, not trying to follow it through and then losing everything that came afterwards, but just watch what nature is presenting to me, focus on it, be 100% present. When it's gone, focus on what's next, and when that's gone, focus again. So in any situation, whether you're playing with little children, or you're walking in the forest, or you're sitting in meditation, whatever, it's the practice of the present moment. Be totally present to the now. So often I find myself, I'm with somebody and I'm thinking about something, the person is really, really boring, and I'm thinking about something else. So I'm not present. So there's some lesson I could have learned and I didn't learn because I wasn't really there. So I would say the practice of the present moment, to be able to distill from the now the messages coming from source itself, store them, make them part of who I am, and now attend to the next lesson in the series. So I would say the practice of the present moment is what's part of all of those different practices.